Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chai Talk from the Left Hook Substack, where I interview a subject matter expert who's usually and oftentimes far smarter than me to break down one big or several big questions in 30 minutes or less. And today I have celebrated a novelist and journalist and reporter, Omar El Akkad, who has a fantastic new nonfiction book coming out in 2 weeks, February 25th in United States. And Omar, it's February 13th in Canada?
Yeah, with the time change,
With
sure.
the title, yeah. And it's called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. It has been getting rave reviews. People are comparing it, Omar, to James Baldwin's works. They're comparing it to Ta-Nehisi Coates. No big deal there, Omar. You know, no big praise, no big shoes. But it is a book that is the book for our times. And someone has described it as a breakup letter with America or the American dream. And you know, the big question and the questions that I have for you is, how do you love a country that doesn't love you back? And is that country still worth fighting for? And I ask this question because reading your book, you talk about coming to America as an immigrant. You grew up in the Middle East, you were in Canada, you came to America, you're a reporter, you covered Ferguson, you covered the War on Terror, you covered Guantanamo. You wrote a novel called American War, which predicted a dystopian future where there's a civil war in America. Lo and behold, this was pre-Trump, folks. And now you have this book, which is a nonfiction book, and the title is based upon a tweet that you did on October 25th of last year, just 3 weeks after the bombardment of Gaza. You put out a tweet, quote, "One day when it's safe, when there's no personal downside to calling a thing what it is, when it's too late to hold anyone accountable, everyone will have always been against this," end quote. That tweet was viewed over 10 million times and has inspired this book. So I ask you, there's a lot to unpack, but breaking news last night, Donald Trump sitting next to Benjamin Netanyahu, whom the ICC called a war criminal, sat there with a passive voice, talked about the destruction of Gaza. Didn't mention who destroyed Gaza, didn't mention how all of a sudden Gaza was destroyed. And then with the next press conference, talked about reading from his notes, so it wasn't just off the cuff. Said, "Well, we're going to move out the Palestinians, and we'll take care of Gaza. We'll take it over. We'll remove the bombs, and it will be the Riviera of the Middle East." That's an exact quote. And as of today, as of this recording, and Wednesday, literally as of 30 minutes ago, he's walking it back. So I go back to your tweet, Omar, with all of that. It's a big setup for this interview. One day, everyone will have always been against this. Have you reached that day, Omar?
Um, First of all, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. As a former journalist, it's the only real job I've ever held down was a newspaper reporter. The fact checker in me feels the need to state that there is no universe in which I'm fit to be compared to someone like James Baldwin or Ta-Nehisi Coates. I have none of that talent, and I'm deeply grateful for any comparison, but I don't exist in that stratosphere. Um, it's interesting. There's there's this book of poetry called Whereas by the poet Layli Long Soldier, and a lot of Whereas is predicated on this motion that the declaration by the U.S. government from a few years back that basically boiled down to, "Hey, indigenous people, sorry about all that genocide. Hundreds of years after the fact, we recognize now it was a bad thing." And she takes it and rearranges it in various ways as an indictment of this sort of after the fact admission of guilt when it's entirely too late to do anything about it.
Mm.
Um, I'm not much of a social media guy. When I sent that tweet out, I don't tweet at all now, but I basically tweet every 6 months. Back then
You're a smart
um,
man, Omar. Stick with that.
it
Learn
is not my
from my
form.
mistake. Don't be a masochist.
I ramble, so it doesn't work for me. But the interesting thing is that I was writing the book independent of that, and after the book was finished, one of my editors thought that that would make a good title for it. So I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to convince people that I didn't just take a tweet and expand it out to 250 pages, you know. Um, the the thing you said at the beginning about this idea of living in a country that doesn't love you back, right? That's a fascinating way of structuring it or framing it because for me personally, I don't mind if the country doesn't love me back. Most
Hmm.
everywhere I've lived, even the country of my birth, Egypt, with the opinions I have, with the books I write, would not love me back in the sense of its sort of political load-bearing beams, would not love me back in any sense of the word. I'm okay with that. Where I think things start to fall apart is when you have a performative nature of a society that is saying one thing, and then you have the active malicious part doing the exact opposite.
Hmm.
Um, for the last year and a half, I have been watching smirking press secretaries talk about how no one has done more for the Palestinians than the United States, as the same administration bankrolls their slaughter.
Hmm.
And now I'm watching someone who doesn't even bother with that pretense. Um, and
Are
I
you
think you
talking
can
about
only
Matt
sort of,
Miller? We can name names.
I mean, Miller smirk is I think going to go down in history. I think it's going to be studied. Um, I just think you can only progress so far as a society when there's such a discrepancy between the thing you believe yourself to be and the thing you really are.
Hmm.
And when what falls in that gap is someone like me not feeling loved enough by the United States, I can live with that. If what falls in that gap is an ongoing genocide, I can't live with that.
And it's interesting because for some people that, especially when you look at Black Americans, right, they fight for a country that doesn't fight for them back. They're supposed to love a country that still doesn't love them back. I was talking to my co-host Danielle Moody, and we were talking about the Tuskegee Airmen because I'm sure you saw Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in his crackdown on diversity. What they originally did was take out the video of surviving Tuskegee Airmen from training, and then once there was brouhaha, that was the one thing they pushed back on. The next day, he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, my bad." And you sit there and go, okay, well, here's Black Americans. To this day, they're erased. And we're brown folks, a son of immigrants, Muslims, and we're erased. And not just the erasure, you see the genocide, literally a genocide, according to Amnesty International, where Gaza is just destroyed now. 45,000 Palestinians killed, and Lancet says up to 70,000. And it's both Democrats and Republicans that did it, right? Biden was complicit. And now Trump has supercharged it. But the rest of us do live here, and you live here, and you pay taxes, and we have family here. And don't our kids then deserve better, Omar? A better country that at least loves them if they're doing everything right? Like, isn't that, don't we have a right to demand respect and reciprocity? Or is that, would you say that is a delusional request with the history of America that you've outlined?
I think we, and I use we here in the widest possible sense, have the right to demand that the stated principles of the society we live in have at least a passing resemblance to what that society actually does. Um, there is no doubt in my mind that the next 4 years are going to be a series of continuous nightmares. Um, I have no idea what's coming next. We're less than a month into this administration.
2.5 weeks.
Yeah, exactly, right? It feels like 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Um, but I have also seen a parade of mainstream liberal progressives either suddenly realize that the genocide was a bad thing now that it's on somebody else's watch, or actively delight in it.
Mm.
You voted against the Democrats. Well, here you go. And what that tells me is that there was never an alignment on principles or mutual liberation or this idea that we have a right to demand a society that actually gives a damn about us. There was pragmatic self-interest, and the second you didn't align yourself with my self-interest, you're out to the wolves. We're done here. Every single Arab American, Muslim American, could have voted differently, and I suspect we'd still have the same president. Um, it's not a matter of a practical effect in the voting booth. This is a matter of know your place. And the second you stop knowing your place, well, you deserve everything you're going to get at this point. That is not a relationship that is the basis for any kind of mutual trust or compassion or care, which I think is the prerequisite of what you're talking about, which is the demands on behalf of my kids who don't know any other place. I mean, I came to this part of the world at 16. I came to the US in my 30s. I know something else. But to make that demand on behalf of my kids who don't know any other place, for whom this is the only home, if I'm going to do that, I need to feel like I am part of a societal fabric that gives a shit about me, that isn't just using me temporarily because our interests happen to momentarily align. We're either in this for a mutual liberation and a mutual solidarity, or we're not in this at all. It's every man for himself.
It was about 62, 63% of Muslims who did vote for Kamala Harris. A majority came out, a majority of Latino women, majority of Asians, and 90% of Black folks, 90% of Jewish women. But there were some people, what I said to folks was if you see your family dying, literally in a genocide, and you're Palestinian, and even Lebanon, because people are forgetting that Israel also bombed Lebanon. I can't begrudge you for uh, not voting for Biden. I get it. And also, I think what we saw is that it was a factor. But even if, like you said, all these folks voted, she still would have lost, probably by a little bit less, but she still would have lost. It was majority white voters who went for Donald Trump. But then there were those folks, I'm sure you saw, Omar, who were from our communities, said, well, vote for Trump, and we don't care about anybody else, and we're going to punish Biden and Harris, right? And you saw, I don't know if you saw today, it just came out 2 hours ago, an Arab American group for Trump just changed their name as of last night. I don't know if you saw this. It's kind of comical. They're like Arab Americans for peace, and I see a friction now because now there's you see this resentment with like there's Black folks saying we told you, and look what you didn't learn from our experience. You went and you screwed us. What's your response to those folks who gave a middle finger to everyone and voted for the worst option?
So there's two things, right? The first is, look, this is a fascist administration. There's no universe in which I align with myself with them actively. It just doesn't exist. I think this is an openly fascist administration. If someone wants to vote for that, you're supposed to be a free country, do whatever the hell you want, but understand what you are voting for.
Mm,
Understand that this cruelty is a part of it. But I think for me, one of the really fascinating things is that inevitably, when we have this kind of conversation, we're talking about consequences, right?
right.
And yet, for some reason, there is such a almost magnetic lure to place the bulk of consequences on the voters and not the political party that was so invested in a genocide that it tanked its own prospects against one of the worst human beings ever to run for president.
Mm.
You know what? If this is a situation where, and I'll openly laugh at something like that, Muslims for Trump or Arabs for Trump, like that, what the hell were you thinking? Okay, but surely consequences work both ways, right? Surely, if you are a strategist in the Democratic Party who thought the best way to win Michigan was to send Bill Clinton to talk to Arabs about what a great thing it was that their relatives are being murdered, surely there must be some consequence there, right? Across the
Literally
board.
to talk down to them during an ongoing genocide. That's what happened.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's there is. I take no pleasure in any facet of American politics right now, except the gains made by things like the Working Families Party at a very local level.
Mm.
Um, there is no universe in which I'm celebrating the fact that someone like Donald Trump is running a grocery store, let alone the government of the most powerful nation on earth. But if we're going to talk about consequences, that knife cuts in both directions.
And speaking about those consequences, as a person who covered the war on terror and as a person who went to Guantanamo and covered Ferguson, right? You have seen, like I have seen, and we're around the same age. I'm older and have more gray hair. Uh, is that
You have more hair generally, so you.
our lives seemed not to matter, right? And I was there at the 2016 DNC. I was covering it for Huffington Post, and I remember Bill Clinton gave this speech. I think it was 30,000 words. And mind you, this was a time where Donald Trump ran on the Muslim ban. And he had one line for Muslims. I don't know if you remember. You know, Muslims, if you're here, if you love freedom, if you're against terrorism, if you're for national security, and you love America, we want you. And I sat there, I'm like, that's like five ands. It's very conditional, right? And this was 2016. And if you recall, the next day, who stole the show? Khizr Khan, the son, I mean, excuse me, a Pakistani Muslim immigrant, and he came in and delivered the Whopper. I just thought it was so beautiful, right? Like, here you are, you kind of just throw us away, and then the person who comes in and saves the DNC and gives the most memorable comments was Khizr Khan. The person who's fighting right now, the one who has the spirit, are black women, Jasmine Crockett and others, AOC, right? And it's time and time again, Omar, that you see like the people of color fight for a country that doesn't fight for them. Was it something about, you know, having covered the war on terror and Gitmo? What was it about Gaza that made you finally say, okay, enough? Like, what was it about the past year that to me, reading your book seemed like this was building, 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 and it finally, if you will, erupted?
I think two things come to mind. Um, I think the last year and a half has shattered my two central defense mechanisms that allowed me to continue to sort of operate as somebody who sounds like this, as somebody who's been attuned to Western culture and the language and all the rest of it since the age of 5, basically. The first was a kind of cold pragmatism, the sense that this is just how the world works. And we can't let something as petty as morality, factor into it. This is the grand game, all of that stuff, which you see when you go to a place like Afghanistan. When I went there to cover it, um, I forget whether I put this in the book or not, but basically the NATO airfield has an outer wire and an inner wire, and the inner wire is the defense for the base proper, and the outer wire is the interface with the highway. So if there's any attacks, they're at the outer wire. That's where the bad things happen. And of course, the inner wire is defended by the NATO soldiers, and the outer wire is defended by the Afghanistani troops because they're the expendable ones, right? There's a hierarchy there. All these people are supposed to be on the same team, and yet it's understood whose life is worth less.
Mm,
Um, you see that stuff, and then there's a part of your brain that thinks, oh, this is just how geopolitics works, and you can kind of numb some part of yourself to it. And the other facet was just instantaneous forgetting. You know, when you're a journalist, you can be as empathetic as you want, and you can really feel for someone else's suffering, but then you get up and you go away. You get to leave, right? That is one of the central privileges of that line of work. And none of that was possible over the last year and a half. The horror was so blatant. And I personally was so complicit. I can sit here and talk to you about what a pacifist I am and how much I abhor all forms of violence, and I can believe all of that good stuff. But by virtue of what my tax money was being used for, I am one of the most violent people on earth. I was killing those kids. And to see that connection so direct and so overt and so easily denied by the people who are supposed to represent me made it impossible to use my regular defense mechanisms to just coast through this and
mm.
say, well, we'll get on the other side of it and it'll be fine.
You know, some could listen and say, well, Omar, you're Egyptian American, you're Canadian American, you're not Palestinian. You know, why do you care so much? And this question has also been asked Viet Thanh Nguyen, you know, who's Vietnamese American, and several other people who aren't Palestinian, right? They're like, well, why do you care so much about that region, right? Why do you care so much about what Israel is doing? And, you know, compared to the Uyghurs and the Rohingya, you know the argument. And so your response to that, like, you are not Palestinian. What is it about this genocide, this atrocity that inspired this moral outrage?
My overarching answer is that we are obligated to give a shit about one another. And if we're unable to do that, then the entire enterprise falls apart. Um,
You mean the human enterprise, society,
The
civilization?
societal enterprise. I mean, so much of day-to-day life is predicated on narratives that, when you dig deep, don't actually function in that life. Every speech and every election is about how we're all in this together and we care for one another, and then you see it in practice, and it's the exact opposite. But more specifically to your question, generally speaking, when I'm asked about something like this, why don't you care about Sudan, the Uyghurs in China? It's generally by somebody who doesn't give a damn about Sudan or the Uyghurs or the Palestinians. The goal here is not some righteous concern with hypocrisy. The goal is to get you to shut the hell up.
That's right.
All right. I mean, anytime you advocate for anything related to climate change policies, you're still breathing the polluted air. You're still part of this machinery that functions on fossil fuels. How dare you? I think the goal is to get people to shut up.
Yeah.
And most of the time, I'm actually happy to shut up, and I'm happy to cede the floor. And absolutely, Palestinians deserve to be heard more than any of us right now. Um, they are the center of whatever liberation is going to look like. And they are the center of what injustice is going to look like. If you think that those drone killings and all of that security and apparatus of mass slaughter is going to stay there, you're mistaken. But beyond all of that, this is a moment where you either say something or you don't, and you live with the consequences for the rest of your life.
And I think it's a very good point that you said the death machine that the military industrial complex is perfecting in places like China against the Uyghurs or against Palestinians is going to be exported. It is going to be globalized. And they're refining it against Palestinians, but we've seen, Israeli intelligence and Krav Maga and the training of U.S. police forces, right? It's going to be imposed upon us. You also mentioned the consequence, right? You're speaking out and you've been very vocal and you wrote this book and you're not pulling your punches. And in your book, you mention some of the consequences of speaking out, especially if you're a person of color, especially if you're Arab, if you're Muslim. We've seen it with many of our friends. We've seen it even with folks who aren't Muslim. Omar, I don't know if you follow movies. I love horror movies. Melissa Barrera, Mexican American actress of the Scream franchise. I've seen every Scream movie. The Scream movies made a lot of money. They had Scream 3 greenlit. She's the face of the Scream movies for people who don't know. And she spoke out and simply reshared an article written by, I believe it was an Israeli scholar on genocide, calling it a genocide. And Spyglass, who produces Scream, got rid of her. And I was like, man, if Melissa Barrera got canceled, what hope will Omar have? And so you're writing this right now where even now, Susan Sarandon got canceled, UTA dropped her. It's so many examples. You sit there and think, hey, I'm a novelist. Contrary to what people think, you don't make that much money, right? Journalists don't make that much money. There's going to be severe consequences for me writing what some have described as breakup letter with America, calling out American imperialism and speaking out so robustly for Palestinians.
I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is that, unlike some of these people you mentioned, nobody knows who the hell I am.
Yet,
And so and so
yet.
there's, it's I think probably less of a big deal, whatever the hell happens to me as a result of this book. Um, but I think also, you know, I've done nothing. I've done less than nothing. I've written a book, so what? There's people out there who are, chaining themselves to the gates of weapons manufacturers, who are stopping the loading of bombs onto ships, who are risking their entire futures protesting on campuses. I have leached so much courage from these people over the last year and a half. I mean, I've written this book and I get it. It's a book that throws a lot of punches, and a lot of punches are going to be thrown back, and that's fine. But as cynical as I've become on institutions, political institutions, cultural, academic, journalistic, I've been so inspired by what individuals have done and the solidarity that they've found. And I get it that it's some days you wake up and it feels like a drop in the bucket, but all of that stuff matters. And yeah, I have no idea what the hell's going to happen with this book. If it's like any other book, probably it gets forgotten about like 2 weeks from now, right? That's generally what happens to most books. Um, but the scale of consequences doesn't compare to anything that I've seen over the last year and a half. Um, and also, there's another kind of consequence, right? Towards the end of my life, when I'm on the other side of whatever this is, and I don't just mean the act of genocide, I mean the occupation, I mean the 75-year-long injustice against Palestinians. I am going to have to ask myself some questions about what I did or didn't do. And even now, like at least I have an unsatisfactory answer of, oh, I wrote a book, I tweeted out, I said a couple of things. That's going to be not nearly enough, but it's so much better than no answer at all. I know so many writers whose MO from the beginning of all of this was to keep your head down.
Yeah.
Just keep your head down, and then years later you can write stories about it. You remember all those Marines who came back from Iraq and wrote story collections about how sad it made them to kill all those brown people? That's coming, right?
Yeah.
Um, I don't want to be that guy. That's all.
The final question I have, it goes back to the title of your book, and perhaps should have been the question that frames all of this. Is we're recording this now in February, and that peace treaty. I guess we could call it a pause, right? It's the three phases still have not been accomplished. Palestinians are still being killed, and now we're openly talking about ethnic cleansing. To go back to the title of your book, one day everyone will have always been against this. Now, as of this recording, do you think America is against this genocide in Gaza, which has been funded and done with active help, support, money, and bombs from the United States of America?
I think individually, if you were to talk to the people in this country or really any country and provided them the details of what happened over the last year and a half, to say nothing over of what happened over the last 75 years, 76 years, I think the vast, vast majority would be against this. I think we have the complicating factor of a US ally and the complicating factor of a narrative framework that is solidly in place that essentially renders Palestinians, specifically, but Arabs, Muslims, Iranians, brown people generally, as subhuman. Um, all of these things factor into a kind of reluctance to take a position that, in the absence of these things, any human being with a functioning conscience would take. Um, it's going to be a long time
Hmm.
before we get to that place. Um, you know, we have these land acknowledgements at the beginning of literary festivals now, and if you've ever been to one, you know exactly what I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Um, it's the final form of this kind of thing. Um, we'll get there one day, maybe not in my lifetime. I have no idea. Um, it just would be nice for once to preempt that and actually do something while there's still something to do.
And while there are still lives and there's still people and a community who are seeking freedom and self-determination. That's it, folks. That's all they want is freedom and self-determination, like the rest of us. The book is One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. Omar, please, I know it's painful for a child of immigrants to do this. Shamelessly promote yourself. How can people support you? How can people find you? How can people read you?
I'm on social media, even though I don't really use it. You can probably find me there. Um, I'll be on tour in Canada and the US. And if I was better at this sort of thing, I would know the places I'm going to, but unfortunately I don't. So we'll
Painful,
have to
Omar.
leave it at
Painful.
that.
You cannot have this answer as you start up your tour, but you could use this as a rehearsal. Follow Omar, read his books. He's written novels. Also, he's written a book called American War, a fictional novel that was very unfortunately present, talking about imagining a dystopian future about the break of America. The book again is One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. It's fantastic. It's coming out this month in February. Buy it, preferably from an independent bookstore. And this has been another episode of Chai Talk with Wajhatli for the Left Hook Substack. Thank you all for watching. As always, stay safe, stay humble, stay decent, be kind, and please don't be a fascist. Thanks for watching.